Hello everyone and welcome to this afternoon's HVG event. If you haven't met me yet, I'm Rhiannon, the events executive for HVG, and it's lovely to see so many people in the virtual room today. So thank you so much for coming. We're going to do two things today. I'm going to hand over in a moment to our HVG Vice Chair Vanessa, who's going to give us a short update on our constitution. And then I'm going to hand over, it's my pleasure to hand over to Tamsin Russell from the Museums Association, who's going to take us through a fascinating session all about EDI and monitoring. So over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Rhiannon, and thanks everyone. I'm just going to give you a few minutes. I'm not going to take too much of your time, honestly, because I'm excited myself to hear Tamsin's session this afternoon. So just wanted to give you a constitution update. At the end of June this year, we wrote to all of you as members and asked for your vote on an update to the Heritage Volunteering Group constitution. We wrote to confirm that we had been in the process of trying to register with HMRC as a charity. And as a charity, what would that enable us to do? It would enable us to raise funds, receive grants and donations, and apply for funds to carry out the work of the organisation. It would enable us to cooperate with and support other charities with similar purposes and to do anything which is lawful and necessary to achieve those purposes, especially with the new strategy that we're putting in place as well. Again, thanks to all the great work that Tamsin's done in actually collecting a lot of your information as well. It gives us an opportunity to do more. And also the other great thing about a charity is it would also reduce or remove any tax payments and we could receive gift-aided donations. Unfortunately, our initial application to become a charity for tax purposes was rejected by HMRC, and they required us to make some changes to our constitution before our application could be reconsidered. So in consultation with HMRC and the Charity Commission, and under their advice, we proposed to simplify our objects and introduce one new clause. The latter prevents us ceasing to operate as a charity. So those changes were as follows. We've removed the current charitable objects in section 2 of the Constitution. We've adopted a new single charitable objective to promote and support volunteering for the benefit of the public within, but without limitation, sites of historic and heritage value, primarily, but not exclusively, in the United Kingdom. We've added an additional clause in section 12b, no amendment shall be made which would have the effect of making the charity cease to be a charity at law. And we've also changed references to alterations in clause 12 to amendments. We sent out a link to the proposed new constitution and a voting form. And I do apologise for those of you that actually saw it twice as well, because there was an error originally in the initial form. But thank you for those that actually made us aware of that. But we did ask you to vote no later than the 17th of July, so we could ratify the changes at today's HVG event. So thank you for letting me do that to enable us to get the constitution back to HMRC. As a membership organisation, we are required to gain your consent for changes to our constitution. So I'm delighted to announce that we received an overall vote of acceptance to progress as proposed. So if you don't have any questions, I'm assuming not unless anybody wants to raise their hand, I am more than happy to thank you very much for your time and for listening, and to hand you over to Tamsin for her session this afternoon. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all of that information. Good afternoon. My name's Tamsin Russell. I sit on the HVG board, but I'm here today in my Museums Association capacity, and also with a clear interest and proven track record in EDI. When HVG first started their EDI journey, they identified that there were a range of different subjects that potentially we could share with the membership. And so we've done one around inclusive volunteering. We ran that again in May of this year. We've done one around specifically inclusive recruitment. But one of the things that came up both from the EDI working group, but also from our members, was around the requirements around monitoring. So what we've done, and what I've done at the Museums Association, is just pull together a fairly light touch presentation, but with an opportunity for you to talk with other members around your own experiences, so that you are better placed to be able to think about implementing, if you haven't done so yet, a way of monitoring the diversity profile of your volunteers, or in addition, just to take some time, a luxury of time, to spend a little bit thinking about how are we doing it, and actually are there any other ways in which we could improve. Now, I wouldn't say I'm an expert in equality monitoring. I do it as part of my remit. So I really would invite other people to share their experience, their expertise with the whole group, either during the breakout groups or when we get to questions and answers, or on the chat function. My philosophy, as always, is if we all share, we all learn, and then we are better placed to do our jobs well. So I'm about to share a set of slides, and you will get these as a PDF after today's event. So hopefully you can see a beautiful sort of indigo colour slide that says Museums Association creating a baseline EDI monitoring. So what we're going to go through today in the time that we have together, I'm going to give a little bit of a reminder of inclusive volunteering, which is what the session was back in May, for those of you that weren't here. If you want to look at that session again, I'm sure we can easily reprise it, but also we've got presentation slides that you can have as well. Going to focus a little bit on you sharing the challenges and barriers to identifying the diversity profile in your own organisation. And also, I don't know why I'm being so negative, some of the successes as well. And then once we've done that, and that's a small breakout room, we'll share some of that feedback. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why we might measure diversity. So what are the drivers for doing so? And again, I'm then going to get you to have a little bit of a mini breakout room, so you can talk about what measures you currently take and what other measures you would potentially like to take or expand. I'm then going to come back as a full group and give you a current practice example from the Museums Association, and then summarise what you might want to do. It says Q&A at the end, but I'm really happy to take questions at any of the points we're together as a large group. And equally, if you want to ask a question on the chat function rather than verbally, I welcome that. And if you want to ask a question anonymously, because I appreciate that sometimes our organisations aren't perhaps as progressive or mature in this area of work, if you want to send an anonymous question to Rihanna, and Rihanna will then send it to us so we can answer it. So that's what we're going to do today. We'll be finished at 4 o'clock, but for those of you that love all things EDI, after a 15-minute break, you're more than welcome to join us on the same invitation for our EDI surgery, which is a really informal opportunity for you to ask questions around any of your own individual problems or challenges that you're facing. So this looks like a long list, doesn't it? So this is 15 points. So this is what we talked about at the M&H show in May, and also at our inclusive volunteering session in May as well. So a whole raft of different things to really ensure that the volunteering practice in your organisation is as inclusive as possible. I'm not going to read through all of these, but some of these are more pertinent to the concept of diversity measurement, diversity profiling, baselines, gathering data. And those 4 things are around identifying your current volunteer profile. I think it's a really good starting point to understand what your priorities and next steps are. Identify your local demographics. So I'm not going to talk about that necessarily in detail, but for example, what information can you gather either through postcode information, through the 2021 census, and any other sort of more local household surveys, etc., that might give you an idea about the extent to which your existing volunteer profile matches your local demographic. And then there's an opportunity really to look at any other data that you collect. And I've highlighted here application rates. So for me, what's really interesting when I'm doing any sort of EDI work, certainly when I'm recruiting for new volunteers, is the extent to which a group of 5 people get through. And they could be the most diverse people you've ever seen. They all apply, but who are the 2 people that we appoint? Oh, they look like everybody else that exists in the organisation already. So actually sometimes reviewing the data at different stages in the volunteer life cycle can be really, really helpful. So this is an example of what a volunteer life cycle might be. Some of the language you might feel is more akin to being an employee, but different organisations use different terminology. But what we would be hoping is that we can attract a group of potential volunteers, and that's through the recruitment side of things. We then select between them, and depending on the number of roles you have, depending on the role description specification, you may well have to adopt a robust selection process for your volunteers as much as you might do for your paid employees. You would then appoint and invite them to participate as part of your organisation. And we would hope that you would have a robust induction process, an orientation process, onboarding, whatever your terminology, to make them feel part of the organisation. Performance is an important part of volunteering. And remember, this, there are lots of different definitions about what a volunteer should be able to do or not. But one of the key differences for me is a volunteer is invited in to undertake volunteering tasks and activities, and they do need to do them to a standard that meets the organisation's requirements, and we will support them in that. Subtle difference to what an intern might be asked to do, which is far more developmental than volunteering generically. We might, I know in my previous organisation at National Museum Scotland, we adopted an annual appraisal approach for our volunteers around their performance. And again, we would hope that we continually to develop them to be able to do what they are doing, but also perhaps what their career aspirations are, if that's a driver for their participation. Progression, well, what do we mean by that? It's about making sure that we're creating a niche and bespoke experience for our volunteers. That makes it most inclusive. So what might that mean is working on a different project in a different site or in a different area of expertise. And then we have to accept that there will be points at which that our volunteers will depart the organisation. And again, I'm really clear for individuals that are volunteering is that if the organisation isn't delivering what they need it to deliver for them, then they need to find another organisation. And that's fine. That's healthy volunteering, healthy turnover. And that's what we want. What we don't want is unhealthy turnover. So we're seeing departures as a function of perhaps a toxic culture or being excluded, harassed or marginalised. The Time Well Spent NCVO report from 2022 looked generically across the UK around what the diversity profile was for volunteers. And remember, this volunteering is not volunteering within the heritage sector, it's much broader than that. And what we saw from that piece of research was that more women than men volunteer. You're more likely to volunteer when you're older than when you're younger. You're more likely to volunteer if you're employed than unemployed or not working, which I think it just really, for me, presents real challenges for our sector. Why aren't we supporting people to volunteer? Obviously, there are issues around being available for interview and all those sorts of things. But what else can we be doing? You are more likely to volunteer if you're part-time than full-time employed. Not a huge surprise there. You were more likely to volunteer if you were in a suburban or rural area than an urban area. So those are those aspects. From an equal perspective, which is I was quite surprised by, certainly around disability, is that actually in terms of the balance of volunteering with individuals that disclosed a disability and those that didn't, it was about the same, and the same in terms of ethnic origin. And I don't use the terminology BAME, but NCVO does. So there was equal participation. And I think, again, this is really interesting because when you look at heritage volunteering, I would suggest that there would be a lack of equal participation from people of colour and people with disability, which just demonstrates the richness of more broader volunteering. So what are we going to go through today? We're going to go through an overview of inclusive volunteering. I've just done that. We're now going to focus on sharing challenges, successes and barriers to identifying the diversity profile. And what I would like my lovely colleague Rhiannon to do is to establish, I think there's 22 people here. I'm not going to go in a room, you'll probably not. Other people may well do. Oh, 21, someone just left, how dare they? So if you could perhaps establish maybe 4 rooms, is that okay? And what I'd like you to do in I would say for this one, I'd like you to have 15 minutes here because I'd like you to introduce yourselves. This is a networking opportunity. And then I'd like you to use these questions really as prompts, and we're not going to do death by feedback. What's far more important at this point is the richness of your conversation. So happy, Rhiannon, for you to establish the groups. Zoom is always much quicker than Teams, which is why I prefer Zoom breakouts. And then we will also put this in the chat function and broadcast it for you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen just for a moment to enable me to do that. And Rhiannon, my lovely colleague, will then establish you into separate groups. Fantastic. Everyone can go into their group. Please join. I always love this, and when people start trickling back in. Now, don't worry if you thought, oh my goodness, I've got so much more I'd like to say about this. You will have another opportunity shortly to go back into your rooms, but I was just conscious of time. Now, for those of you that have attended sessions that I've done before, you'll know I can't bear death by feedback. So the richness is the conversations that you've had, but I also want to make sure that individuals have an open space, if they want to, just to reflect anything that resonated with them or anything that was a surprise or they're intrigued with. So the floor is yours for a couple of minutes, just to share anything that you might want to share, and you can either just start speaking, or you can raise your hand using digital technology, or you can raise your hand if you're on camera. Obviously not very helpful if you're not on camera. Equally, you might want to share any other reflections via the chat function. We're really, really flexible. Alex, lovely to hear from you and see you. Over to you.
Yeah, so we were saying that with putting the diverse programs in, you have to be prepared to put in the time, especially say if you're working with people that have additional needs, different learning needs or physical needs. You do need to make sure that you sort of like allow more time for that individual than you would perhaps with a volunteer without those additional needs. So that does help in planning, you know, to make it an inclusive environment. And the other thing we were discussing as well is that our different museums and heritage sites, they all are in different sort of catchment zones. And like I'm in quite a diverse multicultural town of Bolton, so I do have like culturally a very diverse team of volunteers, you know, from different cultural backgrounds. But it's not the same for other museums that might be more rural, might not have as much of a diverse local community. So sometimes, I mean, for me, for example, it's much easier to have a culturally diverse volunteer team than it would be if I was in remote areas of Scotland. Yeah. So I think it's knowing what sort of like you can actually accomplish, and that you can't force things if you've not got that diversity actually in your local area potentially.
Absolutely, completely. And speaking of somebody that lives and works in Scotland, not rurally, but rurally enough. Yeah, we're really homogeneous, certainly when you're looking specifically around ethnic origin. And whilst adopting remote volunteering or digital volunteering will maybe enable you to cast your net more widely, there are going to be certain limitations around your local demographic. And what I always say to people is just don't beat yourself up about it. You can do as much as you can do with the people that are around you. And that's why it's important to get a sense of what your own profile is and then how it relates to that local demographic at the same time. So absolutely hear that. That's a really good reflection. Thank you, Alex. Any other reflections or conversations that took place? This is usually where there's stony silence, so don't worry, there's no pressure at all, people. Okay, I'm going to leap back in then into the presentation, but there is plenty of other time for you to share other aspects. And then my colleague Rhiannon will also be putting you into groups very shortly. So let me just share my slides. Let me just go back. Where were we? Let me just do that. Smooth this down. Current slide. Okay. So that's what I asked you to do, and you've already started picking up some of the challenges and barriers. So time, I think, is a big barrier. And that's not only, and I think that's a really good call, Alex, around ensuring that you allow more time when you're managing individuals that might have additional support needs, for example, or might need greater access to you, or you might be managing a partnership. So that time is important. But even just the time to pull together a monitoring form, if you've not done that before, can sometimes mean you just don't get round to it. And I think sometimes individuals want a perfect form. Can I just tell you, there is no such thing as a perfect form, and it can build over time. So you might say, do you know what, actually, Tamsin, I just want to, at this point in time, identify these 4 characteristics. And I'm going to create a document on those 4. Brilliant. It doesn't have to be, as we'll talk about, the 9 protected characteristics. It doesn't have to be everything you've ever wanted to know about somebody. You know, this is not you're not finding your lifelong partner here. Sometimes I think some of the challenges around this is about the extent to which we feel if we ask for this information, we're going to get pushback. So I think we have to acknowledge really clearly that some people are happy disclosing information, some people are less happy disclosing information, some people think this is none of your business, some people want to have this information, but they want to have absolutely categorical confirmation it will be kept confidential or anonymous. So what I know is, until you begin to explore with the people that you work with about how they're going to receive it, don't make those assumptions. Increasingly, people are asked for this information and they will share it, but there's also ways and means of creating a robust monitoring form that enables people either to self-describe, for example, or to prefer not to say, and equally all of the different questions you might ask can also be optional. What we do know is that it usually takes 5 years for people within an organisation to feel comfortable completing forms like this. So my advice would be the sooner you start, the sooner you're going to get higher response rates and you're going to get good data sets around the diversity profile. So yeah, don't make assumptions about how it's going to be received, and sooner you start, the better you'll get that robust data. I think people are often worried about where do you store this information? Is it physical storage? Is it digital storage? Obviously, because of its confidential nature and the legislation associated with it, we need to make sure that access is absolutely managed. And also under GDPR regulations or GDP regulations, you need to make sure that the information that you're taking and the purpose that you asked for that information to be provided for, that consent that you've sought out, is also not muddied by you using the data willy-nilly and not for those purposes. I think it's important also to think about those measures. So I've already highlighted that there are 9 protected characteristics that we might expect for lots of people to measure, but there might be broader measures than that, and you might choose to prioritise the measures you want to measure. The likelihood is, if it's not a 12-page document, you're going to get more people to complete it. So only think about the measures that are helpful, not that will distract. And I'm sure there are other challenges and barriers that you've talked about. So I now want to talk a little bit more about diversity measures, or should I say, I want you to talk about them in a moment. But let me just sort of highlight, what you might find is that you are required to measure diversity characteristics as a funder requirement. So that might be a quid pro quo if this is a funded programme, or volunteering is part of an HLF programme. If that's the case, the funder is probably quite clear about the types of information that they want to gather, so use them for that. It could be an organisational requirement, so your organisation wants to take this data for anybody that's engaged. It could be learners, volunteers, freelancers, employees. Again, if it's an organisational requirement, quite likely they will already have agreed measures in place. But you might be thinking, what else do I want to do? Is it about representation? That's my case example I'll talk about in a moment. Is it about participation? Is it a baseline measure so that you know where you are, so you can then think about what you might need to improve? Or is it an improvement measure? So you already know where you are and you want to see whether you've made any positive inroads. So understanding why you're measuring diversity and then the diversity measures you're going to be using is a really critical stage. And I'd advocate you have conversations with different people about that. You might want to also highlight that the reason you're doing this is it's good practice, it's good ethical practice. And again, The Code of Ethics, the Museums Association Code of Ethics, is there to help you. We have particular provision under individual and institutional integrity that talks about a transparent process for employees, volunteers, and others. So again, you can always use this and waggle the code at people if you're worried about how it's going to be received, or if they ask you, why are you doing this? You know, so this is good ethical practice. The other aspect, and I've already alluded to this, is that legal requirement. So the law is really clear. The Equality Act has 9 protected groups. And again, often what we might find either from a funder or equally from an organisation is these are the basic measures that you might want to cover. So I'm going to stop sharing. I am going to put you, or Rhiannon is, to put you into some small groups. And again, we're just going to give you about 9 minutes to talk about this. And what I'm going to ask you to do, and I'm going to put this into the chat function and then also into the broadcast, is I want you to look at those legal measures and think about what you might want to measure as part of your work, but also, is there anything else you would like to measure? Is there anything else that comes to mind? And share what you currently measure or what you don't measure or would like to measure in your groups. So over to you, Rhiannon, if you want to put everybody into a group for about 9 minutes. Hi, welcome back. Lovely to see all these faces coming on my screen. Conscious of time, so we've got 10 minutes. I want to give you a worked example around what we do. Rhiannon's just reminded me that the link for the EDI session at 4:15 is a different session, a different link, and that also might be where we might answer any questions. So if this has really inspired you or highlighted other questions you have, you might want to come along and just ask some questions quickly. But before I go on to the last slides, does anything come up in terms of any of your discussions at all, in terms of anything that resonated you'd like to share? Again, this could be a tumbleweed moment, but over to you if there is anything that you would like to share more broadly. And again, you put your hand up or just put anything in the chat function.
I suppose the only other measure that came up was social economic status.
Yeah,
that some museums are trying to capture that based on requirements from the Arts Council or whatever, and how complicated that actually is. And you know, we were talking about how I think it's the Arts Council asked a question about how would you identify your social economic status based on your parents' professions.
Yes.
And how I was just giving an example. My parents would have been classed as working class, but I have a master's degree and work in a museum service, so that kind of, it's difficult to resonate that, isn't it? And to align it, I guess. So that was what we were talking about.
Yeah.
Most of us were capturing the bulk of the Equality Act, apart from probably things like marriage and pregnancy.
Yeah. Socioeconomic is a really interesting one because ultimately what we're trying to measure is your initial background. So you're a great example, Ben, of social mobility. Well done, a round of applause. And I think that's the reason why we sometimes think, but I'm who I am now, but you weren't who you are now then, but you have gone through a pathway to get you there now. So that's good. That's good. Also, that measure is the most appropriate and robust measure around socioeconomic status. But socioeconomic status isn't necessarily the same as class either. So sometimes people need to separate those out. There's been much discussion about whether people self-describe themselves appropriately. Now, I'm a member of Museum as Mark. They're really, really clear that you don't self-describe, but I've done some more research recently that actually there is a big discussion about it. You know, if you do feel with both of those, you know, I describe myself as working class. So I'm the first ever person in my family to go to university. And my mum was a secretary, you know, so if you look at all of those things, I was working class, I still am, I have to work for a living, but I'm in a professional role. So again, yeah, there are different ways of doing it, but that question about parental occupation is the most significant and informative around EDI. Educational attainment is also an interesting one to add. So let me share my screen in the last 5 minutes and you will get copies of these slides as well. So there are a whole raft of different measures that you could choose to make. And you've already started talking about those, but it's really up to you. So you might want to have more detailed measures around disability, and really talk about the different types or categories of disability if you want that granular data. Neurodiversity, many of the neurodiversity that identify as being neurodivergent or not neurotypical, I should say, don't feel it's a disability and therefore will not necessarily subscribe to that viewpoint. The hearing impaired community is very similar. We've talked about other things. Class, volunteer motivations is still a diversity measure. It just depends on what you want to measure. What's your objective? Care leavers, really interesting because they're a particular group that often is underrepresented or not supported. Ex-armed forces, a group that's often maligned and excluded. It could well be just what their volunteering jigsaw looks like. So what else are they doing with their time? Again, that might give you an idea of whether they're part-time or full-time. Postcode and indices of deprivation. Are they the first to go to a university? Educational attainment, carer status. Carer status and care leavers, refugees and asylum seekers. Thanks to Rhiannon for sharing some of her ideas from Zoological Society. So there's loads you could do. What you need to be clear is, what measures do I need to, want to, and how am I going to use that data? So in the last 5 minutes, let me just sort of talk you through an example. This is an MA example. So these are some questions that I would always ask you to reflect on. So reflect on your objective for gathering data. So our aim is or was to understand current participation and representation in our volunteer profile. Identify when you're going to ask for the data. So we want to measure when we're recruiting to inform positive action, but we also measure our volunteer profile every other year in case there are any changes to profile. So for example, an acquired disability that wouldn't have been gathered at the point of first appointment. Look for equivalent measures for paid staff. So we did, and we've had to tweak the language because it talks about jobs and assessment, etc. And actually the form that we use is slightly different for recruitment to biennial data gathering. Also, how are you going to use or share this data? So knowing what it is, you need to then think about what it's going to be used for. So at recruitment stage, we use it to support the matching of mentors. At the biennial stage, we use it to target our next recruitment campaigns, ultimately. And also I use this in conjunction with the This Is Me page, which is all around exploring additional support requirements for our volunteers. Look at ways to focus attention and commitment. So we're looking at our existing membership profile, but those are issues of range restrictions. So even though I might want everybody to, I don't know, wear green jumpers as a volunteer, if only 2 people in the membership profile wear green jumpers, I'm never going to get to that. What I want to do, I'm not going to set a target, but I just want to see a positive shift over time. So this is our recruitment one. This is a document that gets sent away and sent back with an application form, and it is paired with the person. And we will either see it afterwards or see it before, depending on whether adopting a positive action approach. This is our biennial data gathering, and so we use this for some of our other volunteers. This is the email that I sent out. So we last did this in summer 2021. It's now summer 2023. So they get a link to a questionnaire, and this is all anonymous. So I don't know who does what. It just gets backed into me, and I then have the profile. And this is the form that they fill out. And I have no idea who completes it, but I have an idea of the percentage response rate by the numbers I get back. What we know from our 2021 diversity profile is more of our volunteers were women than men, more were older than younger, fewer were disabled, and fewer museum professionals of colour. So those are real aspects that we need to improve over the next 2 years. So I have just gone through really quickly an overview to inclusive volunteering. I've got you to start to share some of the challenges and barriers to measuring the diversity profile. I've not said, oh my goodness, isn't it woke? Because that could well be part of your organisation's narrative. We've talked a little bit about measuring diversity and the diversity measures, and I've just given you a case example. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides and hand over to Rhiannon, because I think it's probably 4 o'clock. Oh no, it's 3 minutes too. Wow.
Do we have any burning questions before we go? And then I will wrap up. Anyone got any observations or burning questions? I can see Alex, literally.
Tamsin, could you share that link that you send out to your group?
Yeah, don't complete it because I'll muck my data up.
No.
You can absolutely have a look.
Or even not the actual link, but just the questions that you put in.
Yeah, completely.
You know?
Yeah, I'll send you both those things. I'll send that as part of the pack. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Any other observations or questions?
So really good, Eleanor Moore. Yeah, so the guidance from the Market Research Institute it's not what that's what it's Chartered Institute of Marketing. That's what it's called. Means that it's really hard to gather data for groups smaller than 10 people. So in terms of reporting, you can't report on quality data or any data really for groups smaller than 10. So as soon as you've got more than 10, it's fine, but you just need to be really clear about who has access to that information, how you're holding it, and whether there is by that token going to be an opportunity, if it is anonymous, I should say, and it doesn't always need to be anonymous, about whether you can then identify this is Eleanor. It's more problematic when it's like a staff survey, when I've worked out through looking at all of your characteristics, oh, that's Eleanor, and I can work out what you think of this, the senior management team. You wouldn't want that necessarily, but for general monitoring purposes, it shouldn't be that much of an issue, because you're not then extrapolating that data to anything else that could be negative. Does that make sense?
I think
Eleanor.
so. Oh, yes. Yeah, I guess I suppose things like boards of trustees. You know, a lot of organisations at the moment really want to monitor the diversity of their boards, but they're often fewer than 10, aren't they? So, any tips?
So the reality is, it's always optional, isn't it? So as long as everyone consents to doing it and you get their agreement that you will report on it, but it's still not attributable, then you could still do that. You just need to make sure there's a mechanism that you know that the 3 people that didn't respond, for example, you're not then going to treat differently. So it is about just making sure that the anonymity is retained completely. The consent is clear around what you're going to use it for, and then the access. So making sure that no one else gets to see it inappropriately. Yep.
Lovely, thank you, Tamsin. We've had a few other questions. I'm afraid we've run out of time. So what we will do is have a go at answering those and send those around with the pack of information for you. So apologies, we couldn't get to those. Or alternatively, you could go and have a quick comfort break and join us in 15 minutes and we can carry on the conversation. The link is in the chat again. If you're heading off, then have a lovely rest of your day. In August, a lot of people away on holiday, so we will be putting in a morning kind of very free and easy coffee session for anyone who wants to join us, and we can see where the conversation takes us. But otherwise, we will rejoin in September with this meaty content. So that date will come out very soon for August. Have a lovely rest of your day and do join us in 15 minutes for EDI Open Forum. Take care, everyone. See you soon.